Have you ever opened a sacred book and felt something staring back at you from between the lines? Not a verse, not a prophecy, but a presence. In the thousands of pages that make up the Bible, only two giants ever made an entire nation tremble so deeply that their names were whispered, avoided, even feared. One stood in the valley of Elah, armored in bronze, that caught the sun like fire, his voice rolling across the hills like thunder. The other ruled an ancient kingdom in the highlands of Bashan, a king so massive, so enduring that surrounding nations believed he was not merely a ruler, but the last living echo of a forgotten age of giants. If these two men had not fallen, the future of Israel would have split like a river breaking against stone. What made them so dangerous? Why does Scripture treat their existence as turning points in the story of God's people? Two giants, two battles, one destiny. One giant threatens the present, the other haunts the past. And together they confront every believer with a question no one escapes. What do you do when the thing standing in front of you is bigger than anything behind you? If Goliath stands for the fear you meet face to face, Og of Bashan is the fear that reaches for you from generations before. One rises suddenly like a storm. The other sits upon a throne carved from centuries of dread. Tonight, the veil lifts. You will walk into the valley of Elah and hear the bronze echo of a man nearly 3 meters tall. You will ascend into Bashan, where ruins still whisper about a king whose iron bed stretched longer than some rooms in your home today. And you will discover why their defeat was more than military victory. It was spiritual reclamation. This is not a story about ancient warriors. It is a story about the giants we all face, those that roar in front of us and those that shadow us from the past. Welcome to a place where we do more than read Scripture. We uncover what has been hidden in plain sight, locked between history and revelation. If your heart is ready, step across this threshold. The gate opens now, and our journey begins with the storm that brewed between Israel and the Philistines. To understand the giants, you must first understand the world that forged them. A world lit by furnace fire, hammered into shape on anvils soaked in sweat, fear, and ambition. And in that world, 5 cities burned brighter than all the rest. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron. 5 iron thrones rising from the southwestern coast of Canaan, glinting like embers scattered by a restless wind. They were more than cities. They were the beating heart of a people the ancient world called the Philistines. They arrived like a storm from the sea. Refugees, warriors, craftsmen, wanderers, part of the mysterious sea peoples, whose origins still stir debate among historians. Some say they came from Crete, others from the wider Aegean, but whatever their birthplace, when they reached the shores of Canaan, they brought something no one else possessed: iron. Iron was more than metal, it was power. It was the future. It was the language of empires. While other nations hammered bronze into spears, the Philistines forged iron into weapons that cut deeper, held longer, and shattered the hopes of their enemies. Iron changed everything. It made their armies stronger, their tools sharper, and their dominance nearly inevitable. And this is where the contrast becomes almost cruel, because Israel at the time was not a kingdom, not an empire, not a military power. Israel was a family of tribes scattered across hills and valleys, unified only by their covenant and their fragile hope in the God who had carried them out of Egypt. While the Philistines stamped their identity into iron blades, Israel still swung wooden handles and repurposed farming tools. If the Philistines were a machine, Israel was a prayer. This clash was never merely steel against wood. It was a confrontation of belief, culture, and destiny. But why did these two peoples collide with such explosive force? Why did their paths seem magnetized toward conflict? Part of the answer lies in geography. Philistine cities commanded the coastal plain, the major trade routes, and the fertile lowlands. Israel lived in the highlands, where soil was thin, harvests uncertain, and travel difficult. To grow, Israel needed access to the plains. To survive, the Philistines needed to keep them out. But there is another layer, deeper, older, almost mythical. The Philistines carried memories of the Aegean world. Their pottery, their headdresses, even their script whispered of distant islands and forgotten wars. They were outsiders in Canaan, fiercely protective of their identity, suspicious of those who lived inland. Israel, on the other hand, carried the memory of a promise, a land, a covenant, a future shaped not by iron, but by divine calling. Two peoples, two stories, two destinies colliding on the same strip of earth. A collision was inevitable. The Philistines did not fear Israel's swords. They feared Israel's God. And this fear, mixed with pride, mixed with the need to dominate, drove the Philistines to become the shadow that stalked Israel for generations. Whenever Israel tried to rise, Philistine pressure pushed them back down. Whenever Israel sought unity, Philistine raids shattered them apart. Whenever Israel prayed for deliverance, the Philistines seemed to tighten their grip. This tension simmered for decades, each side waiting for the other to blink. Until one day the Philistines marched into Judah again, not to conquer land, but to break Israel's spirit. This is the soil where giants grow, because in the Iron Age the Philistines understood something many armies forget. You do not need to defeat a nation to own it. You only need to make it afraid. And fear was the weapon they mastered better than iron. Now imagine living in that world. A world where every valley echoed with the clang of foreign armor, where each sunrise threatened a new raid, where every victory felt temporary and every defeat felt final. A world of iron, with hearts struggling to stay soft. If you've ever felt surrounded by a world stronger, faster, or harder than you, if you've ever lived in a land of iron while carrying a heart still carved from softer wood, let your reflection rest here for a moment. We walk this journey together, eyes open to the world behind the pages. Because once Israel understood their enemy, once they saw the iron cities, the disciplined ranks, the polished armor, the Philistine war machine, they believed they knew what danger looked like. But the greatest threat was still walking toward them. A single man, a lone figure, a giant from Gath whose shadow would stretch across all of Israel. And he was about to step into the valley of Elah. The valley of Elah wakes slowly like an old lion shaking dust from its mane. Dawn stretches across the ridges, touching the scattered tents of Israel with pale light. For a brief moment, the world is quiet. And then a shadow moves. At first, it is only a shape, distant, indistinct, almost impossible to judge. But as it approaches the line where sunlight meets earth, the figure rises higher and higher, until the valley itself feels smaller beneath it. He does not stride, he looms. And in that moment, thousands of men, hardened shepherds, seasoned fighters, tribal captains realize this is no ordinary warrior. This is something else. Goliath of Gath, a colossal man wrapped in bronze. 57 kilograms of armor plates shimmer across his chest like molten stone. A spear rests in his hand, tipped with 7 kilograms of sharpened iron, the weight of a modern bowling ball shaped into a killing point. And before him walks a shield bearer carrying a tower-shaped shield so large it could eclipse half a man. He does not come to fight. He comes to terrify. Goliath's voice rolls across the valley like thunder trapped in a cave. Morning after morning, evening after evening, 40 days in total, he steps into the open and unleashes the same challenge, a duel, one champion from Israel. Winner takes all, but his timing is the true strike. He appears at sunrise and at sunset, precisely the hours when Israel prays. Every morning he interrupts their hopes. Every evening he steals their peace. In ancient warfare, killing was simple. Breaking the spirit, that was mastery. And Goliath was a master. Goliath's greatest weapon was not his spear. It was his ability to turn a valley into a prison of fear. Now imagine the fear from Israel's side. The valley floor is narrow. A duel here is unavoidable, inescapable, like being dragged into a spotlight against your will. From the slopes above, Israel's soldiers watch a man who stands nearly 3 meters tall. A man with armor like a second skeleton. A man built by the Philistine war machine to be their ultimate symbol of invincibility. But a question lingers. Why does Goliath move so slowly? Why does he need a shield bearer in front of him? Why does he seem unable to change direction, quickly swaying like a tower, rather than pivoting like a fighter? Some historians and military analysts suggest a clue buried in ancient language. The Hebrew word used to describe Goliath's movements, Baal Hara'ah, can imply impaired sight or limited depth perception. If Goliath suffered from giantism, a condition often linked to vision problems, then everything changes. He is still massive, still terrifying, but also vulnerable. The giant who terrified Israel may have seen the world through a narrow, blurry tunnel. His armor, impressive as it is, would have been unbearably heavy in the uneven hills of Elah. Bronze absorbs heat. The weight restricts movement. Every step is a battle against gravity itself. He is a fortress, but a slow one. Yet none of this matters to Israel because fear does not negotiate with logic. Fear paints monsters without flaws. On day 1, Israel whispers. By day 20, they tremble. By day 40, they have surrendered inwardly even before the battle begins. Every morning, Goliath kills their confidence. Every night, he buries their hope. And in that silence, the valley becomes a mirror, forcing each man to confront the question he dreads most. Am I enough? When a giant stands before you, the real battle is not with him, but with the voice inside that tells you to run. Yet hidden beneath this terror is something deeper, almost prophetic. Goliath represents more than military strength. He carries the pride of Philistine culture, the roar of their Iron Age, the unshakable belief that they were destined to rule. His armor is the Philistine economy. His spear is their technology. His presence is their theology. We are strong, you are weak, we own the valley. And through him, the Philistines seek not just to win a battle, but to crush the soul of Israel. But valleys have a strange way of shifting the fate of nations. A battlefield can become a stage, a threat can become a revelation, and a giant can become a doorway. Because somewhere beyond the ridgeline, a pair of young hands is carrying food to his brothers, unaware that destiny is waiting in the shadow of the giant's voice. One more morning, one more sunrise, and a shepherd will enter the valley, not to watch, but to answer. On the morning that would change everything, no one in Israel woke expecting a miracle. The valley of Elah was already heavy with despair, its air thick with the echo of Goliath's taunts. And somewhere far from the front lines, a shepherd boy gathered bread, cheese, and grain, simple provisions meant only to feed his brothers. David came not with a sword, but with lunch. To the soldiers he was a child, to his brothers he was an inconvenience, to the world he was invisible. But the kingdom of heaven has always had a strange habit. It grows giants in places no one is watching. As David reached the ridge overlooking the valley, he heard it, the thunderous bellow that had broken Israel's courage for 40 straight days. The young shepherd froze as if listening not just with his ears, but with his spirit. Something stirred in him, something ancient and instinctive, the same force that had risen in him when a lion lunged at his flock or when a bear dragged a lamb into the shadows. David had fought alone in the wild long before he ever fought in a valley. The world saw a boy. God had seen a warrior. David ran toward the front lines, curiosity overpowering caution. Soldiers whispered about rewards, wealth, marriage, freedom from taxes. But none of these rewards seemed to touch David's heart. What shook him was something else entirely, the insult Goliath hurled at the God of Israel. It was not pride that ignited David. It was outrage, a wholly startling, burning clarity. When his eldest brother Eliab saw him, jealousy rose like smoke. Why are you here, who is watching the sheep? You just came to see the battle. Words meant to shrink him, but David brushed them aside the way he had once brushed aside the branches of the Judean hills. He asked again about the giant. He wanted truth, not rumor. The moment he spoke, something changed. Hope, thin as a thread, moved among the men. Not hope in themselves, but in the tone of David's voice. It carried a confidence they had forgotten. Word reached Saul. The king demanded to see the boy. It is here in the tent of a weary king that the world first meets the faith of a future king. Saul towered over David, draped in royal armor. David stood barefoot, smelling of sheep and wilderness. Saul saw innocence. David saw destiny. Let no one lose heart because of this Philistine, he said. I will fight him. The tent fell silent. A hush so sharp it felt like the air had split. Saul's first reaction was disbelief. You are only a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth. But David did not flinch. He told Saul about the lion, how he seized it by the beard and struck it down. He told him about the bear, how he fought it in the night alone with no glory and no witness. When no one was watching, David had been forged. Swords do not make kings. Battles in the wilderness do. Saul studied the boy. Something in David's eyes, fire, resolve, a calm born of chaos, convinced the king more than any soldier ever had. "Go," Saul said, "and the Lord be with you." Then Saul offered his armor, bronze helmet, heavy coat, royal sword. David tried them on, but the weight dragged him down. It was armor made for a king, made for Saul's height, Saul's strength, Saul's story, not David's. He returned the armor gently, respectfully, not because he was afraid, but because he knew something most people forget. You cannot fight giants wearing someone else's calling. David understood the secret of the battlefield. Victory begins by being yourself. So he walked to the stream. The water murmured around his feet as if whispering encouragement. David knelt, searching the riverbed for smooth stones. 5. Not because he lacked faith, but because he understood preparation. Even miracles require intentionality. With his sling in hand and the stones in a shepherd's pouch, David stepped toward the valley floor. Every soldier watched him pass. Some pitied him, some mocked him, some prayed for him, but the sun was shifting overhead, cutting a line of gold across the valley. It was as if the heavens themselves were drawing a spotlight toward the place where history was about to bend. David walked with no armor, no sword, no fear. He walked as if the valley belonged to him. And in a way, it did. For the first time in 40 days, the Valley of Elah felt different, not because Goliath had changed, but because someone finally approached him without trembling. And as David descended the slope, sling at his side and faith burning hotter than iron, a new chapter of the story rose in the air like a coming storm. The boy was stepping into the valley, and the giant had no idea what was walking toward him. The tent of Saul was quiet when David stepped out, leaving behind the bronze armor that had glimmered like a promise of legitimacy. To an ordinary eye, David's refusal looked reckless, almost insulting. Who walks into a valley against a giant without armor? But David understood something crucial, something spiritual, tactical, and deeply personal. He could not fight wearing the story of another man. Saul's armor was crafted for a king already established, a warrior already trained, a man already seasoned by war. David was none of these things. The armor didn't fit because the calling wasn't his. Some battles can only be won with the identity God gave you, not the identity others expect you to carry. David descended the ridge lightly, as if weighing less than the fear that clung to every soldier watching him. He walked down to the stream that cut across the valley floor, a ribbon of living water glistening beneath the sun. Kneeling, he touched the stones, resting beneath the currents, smooth, cool, shaped by years of quiet erosion. He chose 5. Not because he doubted a miracle, but because preparation is the language of faith. The sling he carried was not childish. In the ancient world, slingers were elite specialists. Their projectiles could reach speeds exceeding 145 kilometers per hour, fast enough to shatter bone and pierce skull. Some ancient armies placed slingers alongside archers, knowing their accuracy at medium range could be devastating. This was not a toy. It was the perfect weapon for the perfect moment. As David rose from the stream, something changed in the air, not in the valley, in him. A shepherd holding a sling felt more dangerous than a king holding a sword. Goliath stood waiting, unaware of the quiet calculations unfolding around him. The giant saw a boy, but the boy saw a target. Historians and medical scholars have long debated Goliath's stature and condition. Some suggest that his giantism, likely acromegaly, would have impaired his vision. Tunnel vision, double images, blurry depth perception. If this is true, then David's strategy becomes not only courageous, but brilliantly calculated. A slow, heavily armored giant with limited vision against a fast, agile slinger with perfect accuracy, strength versus precision, weight versus speed, iron versus faith. The valley held its breath as David stepped into full view. His presence seemed almost absurd, simple tunic, shepherd's pouch, sling in hand. Goliath's laughter erupted, echoing off the hills like rolling thunder. He mocked David's youth, his size, even his beauty, calling him a dog coming with sticks. But David did not shrink. He answered with a sentence that would echo through millennia. "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." In that moment, the valley changed sides. The taunts of the giant suddenly sounded hollow. The confidence of the Philistines wavered. The trembling of Israel steadied. Because for the first time in 40 days, someone had spoken into the valley with authority that did not come from armor or rank or iron, but from heaven. David's words were not bravado, they were revelation. He was declaring what every generation of believers would one day discover: faith does not ignore fear. Faith confronts it with a greater allegiance. David wasn't fighting Goliath for Israel. He was fighting Goliath for the honor of God. The giant drew nearer, shield-bearer straining to keep pace. Goliath's movements were predictable, straight, heavy, slow. David, by contrast, moved like wind through grass. Two worlds collided, one forged by human strength, the other upheld by divine promise. And this historical moment, this confrontation between a boy with a sling and a giant with iron, holds theological weight far beyond the battlefield. Because it reveals how God breaks cycles of fear, how God uses the unexpected, how God chooses the humble to shame the mighty. David's story is not merely military genius. It's a testament to what happens when someone rejects the armor of the world and steps into the identity heaven crafted for them. When you fight the battles you were designed for, even a valley becomes a throne room. Now the valley trembles with anticipation. The sun dips lower, painting the scene in bronze and gold. David stands ready. Goliath stomps forward, a mountain of arrogance wrapped in iron. Israel watches from the cliffs, breathless. Philistine soldiers grip their weapons, expecting an easy execution. But history is about to betray their expectations. The boy and the giant are seconds away from a collision that will reshape the destiny of nations. And in the stillness before the clash, before the sling spins, before the stone flies, before the giant falls, the valley holds its breath one last time. Because next part begins with the most astonishing moment of all the strike that no one saw coming. There are moments in Scripture that feel less like ancient history and more like the heartbeat of a living story, moments when time seems to slow, when the world narrows to a single breath. The Valley of Elah is holding such a moment now. David steps forward, not with hesitation, not with bravado, but with the calm certainty of someone who has already won in a place deeper than the battlefield. Goliath advances, iron rattling like a waking beast. Every step he takes sends a tremor through the ground. To Israel, it sounds like doom approaching. To David, it sounds like opportunity. In the face of overwhelming strength, faith does not shrink, it sharpens. David reaches into his pouch. His fingers brush against smooth stone, the one shaped by water, refined by time, perfected for this single instant. He pulls it out slowly, as if savoring the final quiet before history ignites. Goliath lifts his spear. The sun glints off the iron tip like the flare of a comet. But the giant's movements are heavy, predictable, telegraphed through layers of bronze. David breathes in, and the valley seems to breathe with him. The sling begins to spin, soft at first, then faster still. Air whips around the cords, humming like a living creature. This is no desperate gamble. This is precision, discipline, divine preparation meeting the perfect moment. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the mastery of it. Goliath roars and rushes forward, shield-bearer stumbling to keep pace. The valley shakes under his charge, and then David releases. The stone leaves the sling like lightning freed from a storm cloud. It cuts the air with a sound so sharp it seems to split the sky. For a heartbeat, the world goes silent. Then impact. The stone sinks into Goliath's forehead, landing at the one point unprotected by armor, the one place where giantism's frailties meet a shepherd's accuracy. The giant freezes, eyes wide, body swaying, realization dawning too late. And then he falls, not like a man, like a monument, like a pillar of fear collapsing under its own weight. When the giant fell, the fear of a nation fell with him. The earth groans as Goliath's body hits the ground. Dust spirals upward, wrapping the valley in a shroud of astonishment. Every Philistine soldier's jaw locks in disbelief. Every Israelite's heart thunders awake as if someone has flung open a window in a suffocating room. David stands over the fallen giant, a shepherd over a warrior, soft cloth over iron, faith over intimidation. And in the quiet that follows, Israel sees something they had forgotten. Giants can bleed. Giants can fall. Giants can be defeated. Narratives of defeat dissolve the moment someone chooses to fight differently. The Philistines break first. Their terror erupts like a dam cracking open, flooding their ranks with panic. They turn, they run, and Israel, who moments earlier stood frozen, now surges forward. Swords rise, voices unite. A roar of victory spills across the valley, not because they have become stronger, but because the weight on their spirit has been shattered. One moment of faith from one person has changed the trajectory of an entire people. This is the mystery of Elah. The valley was never about brute strength. It was about the spiritual contagion of courage. Just as fear spreads like a sickness, courage spreads like fire. David does not raise his arms in triumph. He does not turn to the crowd for applause. He simply stands in the truth of what God had done, not through armies, not through armor, but through obedience. And that truth lingers across time, reaching into every life that has ever faced its own giant. If you have ever lived through an Elah moment where a single step of courage shifted your entire world, share it. Not to boast, but to leave a trail of hope for someone standing before their own giant. Your story might be the stone someone else needs. The dust of the valley settles. Goliath's shadow evaporates. Israel's chains of fear lie broken in the dirt. But the story of giants is far from over, because while one giant falls in Elah, another giant still sits on a throne far to the north. And he is not merely a warrior, he is a king. The journey now turns toward the ancient highlands of Bashan, where an even older fear waits. Long before Goliath's bronze armor clattered against the dust of Elah, before David's stone carved its place in history, there was another giant one, whose shadow stretched across centuries. To find him, we turn the sacred pages to Deuteronomy, where a name rises like a mountain from the text. Ogu, king of Bashan, not a champion sent to intimidate, not a soldier selected for size, but a monarch crowned and throned and feared by every nation that bordered his realm. If Goliath was a spectacle of the Iron Age, Og was a surviving echo of something older, much older. The Bible calls him the last of the Rephaim descendants of the primordial giants that roamed the land before the flood. Bashan, his kingdom, was no ordinary territory. It was the northern frontier of ancient Israel's destiny, a land of volcanic plateaus and rich pasture lands. Black basalt rock lined the region like scars from an ancient fire. Massive stone structures, dolmens, and fortified cities hinted at a people who built for giants, not ordinary men. The region itself seemed to breathe myth. To the Israelites camped on the plains of Moab, the stories of Bashan were whispered with caution tales of towering warriors, ruthless kings, and fortresses carved into the mountainside. And at the center of it all stood Og, the last remnant of a forgotten age. He was not merely tall, he was monumental. The Bible does not waste words when it speaks of him. Instead, it gives a single detail, simple but staggering. A relic preserved by the Ammonites not to honor him, but to prove he once lived. His bed of iron was over 4 meters long, not legend, not myth, recorded in scripture as evidence. A 4-meter iron bed, iron not wood, not bronze, but iron rare and expensive, even in the Iron Age. It was less a piece of furniture and more a monument, a statement of power, a reminder that the king who slept upon it was no ordinary mortal. This was no duel in a valley, no boast echoing across hillsides. Og ruled a kingdom. He commanded armies. He sat upon a throne. Facing Goliath was terrifying. Facing Og was like confronting an entire era of giants that refused to die. The terror surrounding Og was not theatrical. It was ancestral. Generations of Canaanite lore described the Rephaim as towering beings who once filled the land with dread. Some scholars link them to ancient traditions of the Nephilim, though scripture keeps those connections veiled in mystery. And here stood the last of them, a living reminder that the fears of old had not fully vanished. a giant not of the battlefield but of memory, a king whose height symbolized domination, whose reign embodied the dread of a land resisting Israel's promise. But why does the Bible spend so much narrative weight on this king? Why is his existence preserved with such clarity? Because Og represented a different kind of threat. He was not merely a physical giant. He was a spiritual obstacle, a relic of an age that stood in stark opposition to the unfolding storyline of redemption. To enter the Promised Land, Israel had to confront not just enemies of flesh and blood, but the very symbols of fear embedded in the land's ancient past. Og was that symbol. He was the embodiment of the sentence, "You will never be enough." The Israelites, weary from wilderness wandering, would soon face their greatest test. Not Goliath, not Philistine steel, but a colossal king ruling from the heights of Bashan, surrounded by fortified cities that pierced the horizon like stone teeth. Og's size, his bed, his legacy, his mythic presence, none of it intimidated Moses. Where Saul shook before Goliath, Moses stood firm before Og. Where Israel trembled in Allah, they steadied their hearts on the plains of Edrei. Because God's words to Moses sliced through the noise of fear. "Do not be afraid of him, for I have handed him over to you." Fear had shaped Og's legend. Faith would end it. The giant who symbolized a bygone era would fall. Not because Israel was strong, but because God was present. The fall of Og would become a turning point, the moment Israel realized that the ancient terrors of the land were no match for divine promise. Where one era of giants ends and another era of inheritance begins. Now the path of the narrative bends northward, towards a battlefield carved into basalt and memory. For in the next part, Israel will rise to confront the king of Bashan and everything he represents. The march toward Bashan began with a tension that clung to the air like dust before a storm. Israel had faced kings before. They had fought battles, they had endured wilderness hunger serpents and rebellion, but nothing in their long, agonizing journey prepared them for the silhouette rising in the distance. The highlands of Bashan stood like a wall against the sky, jagged volcanic carved by ancient fire. Fortresses crowned the ridges, stone teeth from another age. Cities built from black basalt watched the approaching Israelites with silent contempt. And somewhere beyond those ramparts, Og waited. Word of the giant king had traveled ahead of him. His reign was old enough to be legend, strong enough to be feared, and brutal enough to command obedience. When Israel reached the border, the stories became real. Og marched out to meet them, not in a valley like Goliath, not with taunts or theatrics, but with the disciplined quiet of a ruler who believed his strength was unbreakable. Behind him came armies, chariots, soldiers hardened by the harsh terrain of Bashan. Israel froze. Some giants roar to intimidate you. Others terrify you simply by existing. To the Israelites, Og was not just a king, he was a living symbol of everything they feared. The final remnant of the Rephaim, the last giant of a terror-soaked era. A reminder that even as they neared the Promised Land, the past still had one last shadow to cast. Fear rippled through the camp, not the loud, chaotic fear of battle, but the quiet, suffocating fear that steals breath from the lungs. Men glanced at Moses with eyes already defeated. Women gathered their children, whispering questions they dared not voice aloud. And then Moses looked to heaven, and heaven answered. A voice rose not in thunder, not in spectacle, but with certainty that cut deeper than a blade. "Do not fear him, for I have handed him over to you." When God speaks into your fear, the giant loses the battle before it begins. Those words settled over Israel like a mantle of courage. The trembling eased, the panic thinned. Something ancient and unbroken stirred in their chest, the memory of Red Sea walls, manna on the groundwater from stone. The God who had carried them through wilderness now stood before the giant. The battle erupted near Edrei, the frontier fortress of Bashan. Og's armies thundered forward with confidence born from centuries of dominance. They expected an easy slaughter, but they met a different Israel, a nation finally standing in the full weight of its calling. Israel did not fight like people defending themselves. They fought like people claiming what had been promised. The battle with Og was not just a military conflict, It was a spiritual exorcism of the land. The shadow of the giant king stretched long across the battlefield, his presence towering above his soldiers. Yet the armies of Israel pressed hard, wave after wave, unified by a courage that had not been there moments before. What changed? Not the giant, Israel. And in a sudden, jarring swing of fate, Og fell. The last of the Rephaim collapsed under the weight of a promise older than his throne. When his body hit the earth, the terror of an entire era shattered like cracked stone. His fall marked the end of a lineage that once made whole nations tremble. From that moment, the land east of the Jordan, rich, fertile, wide, as hope itself, belonged to Israel. Gilead, Argob, half of the plateau of Bashan, territories once steeped in myth, now became inheritance. For the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, these lands were not just geography, they were prophecy fulfilled. The promise made to Abraham centuries before had advanced another decisive step. Israel was not merely surviving, they were becoming. And in the quiet after the battle, the truth settled gently around them. Sometimes the final barrier between you and your calling is a fear that looks too old, too large, too deeply rooted to overcome, until God steps in and says, "Do not be afraid." If you have ever heard a whisper in your heart saying, "Do not fear," let that moment return to you now. And if you feel led, share it. These stories, your stories, become the strength someone else needs to rise. Og lay silent, his kingdom silent, his legacy broken. But for Israel, the journey did not end here. Giants had fallen, victory had come, and fear had been silenced. Yet there was still one more battlefield left to conquer. For every ancient story has a mirror in the present. From giants of the land to the giants living in the human heart, there are moments when the dust of ancient battles begins to settle, and suddenly the battlefield transforms into a mirror. For thousands of years, readers have looked at Goliath and Og as distant figures, giants of another world, another time. But the truth is more unsettling, more intimate. Their shadows still fall across our lives. Goliath stands for the fear that confronts you in the open, the pressure you can feel, the voices that insult, belittle, and predict your defeat, the expectations of others, the noise of the world that tells you you're too small, too late, too unprepared. He is the giant of the present. Og, on the other hand, guards the gates of the past. He represents something older, heavier, more deeply rooted. He carries the weight of childhood wounds, the sting of old failures, the echo of words spoken long ago that still rattle in the soul. He is the giant who whispers from the dark corners of memory, "You will always be this. You will never be more." Goliath is loud. Og is silent. One shouts at your face. The other sits on the throne of your history. Both giants fight for the same prize, your movement. Both want you frozen. Both want to convince you that destiny is for others, not for you. They do not need to defeat you physically, they only need to keep you still. But Scripture reveals something profound. Neither giant was brought down by raw strength. Neither fell because Israel suddenly became powerful. They fell because someone, David in one case, Moses in the other, chose to confront fear instead of carry it. In other words, giants die when faith moves, but every person carries their own sling faith to see possibility, discipline, to stay the course, memory of small victories, community that lifts, and obedience that pushes fear aside. Sometimes the sling feels too small. Sometimes the stones feel insignificant. Sometimes you feel foolish even reaching for them. But Scripture teaches that it is not the size of your weapon that changes history. It is the direction of your courage. Look again at David. He did not deny the danger. He did not pretend Goliath was weak. He simply believed that fear did not get the final word. Look again at Moses. He was older, tired, worn by years of leading a difficult people. Yet when the voice of God said, "Do not fear," he stepped forward, not because he was strong, but because he trusted the one who was. Faith does not make you fearless. Faith teaches you to walk while afraid. And this is where the story of the two giants bleeds into the soil of your own journey. Every person who seeks to grow, to transform, to follow God's call, must face two categories of fear: the fear that confronts you today, and the fear that has followed you for years. One stands in your path, The other stands in your memory, and both must fall. But here is the hidden beauty woven through these ancient narratives. Neither Goliath nor Og falls because Israel is extraordinary. They fall because God is faithful, because God meets courage with deliverance, because God honors the step forward even when the ground trembles. No giant is immortal. Even the oldest fear has an expiration date. Even the loudest threat eventually collapses. Giants do not endure forever, only God does. Fear survives only when you feed it. Faith grows every time you act on it. So ask yourself, which giant stands in front of you now? Which giant sits on the throne of your past? Which voice is telling you to stop, to shrink, to surrender the valley God has placed in front of you? And which stone faith, discipline, memory, community, obedience has God already placed in your hand? For the people of Israel, the fall of Goliath opened a path for a shepherd boy to become a king. The fall of Og opened a path for a scattered people to enter their inheritance. One battle shifted a moment, the other shifted a generation. And now this narrative, ancient, sacred, and fierce, leans toward your life with quiet invitation, because the story does not end with the giants falling. It continues with what Israel became afterward. And so the question lingers in the air, waiting for the next chapter in your journey. When your giants fall, what story will begin? In the end, the story of the two most dangerous giants in the Bible is not simply a tale of ancient warriors or long-forgotten kingdoms. It is the story of fear that stands in front of you like Goliath, and fear that follows behind you like Og. It is the story of the human heart, learning again and again that the battles which shape us most are never won by strength alone. They are won when faith becomes louder than fear, when trust outgrows intimidation, and when ordinary people take extraordinary steps toward the destiny set before them. Throughout this journey, we have walked through valleys and highlands, faced bronze and iron, watched shepherds become warriors and giants crumble into dust. And now, as the dust settles, one truth remains clear: your giants do not fall because you are powerful. They fall because God is present. The story may close here, but its reflection continues, because every viewer carries their own valley of Elah, their own Bashan, their own quiet battlefield, where decisions shape futures. And long after this video ends, those decisions, those steps of courage, those moments of trust will keep writing the next chapter of your faith. If this journey has stirred something within you, let your voice be part of this community. Share your thoughts, your questions, your experiences in the comments below. You never know who might draw strength from your story. And if this message has lifted your heart, consider liking this video so it can reach others who need the same reminder. Subscribe and stay with us as we continue exploring the hidden histories, the ancient mysteries, and the spiritual pathways woven through Scripture. There is so much more waiting beyond this horizon. And as you step back into your own world, your responsibilities, your struggles, your decisions carry this with you. In the valley of Elah in your own life, you do not stand alone. The wind that once carried David's stone still moves. It still whispers courage. It still clears the path, and it waits to lead you into the next revelation.